the radio home of the 76ers.
Oh, boy, what a move by Embiid.
97.3 ESPN, WENJ, WENJ-HD, Millville, Atlantic City. This is the Sports Bash Warm-Up with Josh Hennig on 97.3 ESPN. Now, live inside the Matt Black Kia Studios, here's Josh Hennig.
At that point, Michael provided a lot of guidance for me. Like, I had a question about shooting this turnaround shot, so I asked him about it. And, he gave me a great detailed answer. But on top of that, he said, if you ever need anything, give me a call. It's like my big brother. I truly hate having discussions about who would win one-on-one. And you're a fan saying, hey, Kobe, you beat Michael one-on-one. I feel like, what you get from me is from him. I don't get 5 championships here without him, because he guided me so much and gave me so much great advice.
That was Kobe Bryant last night on The Last Dance on ESPN TV. Of course, The Last Dance episodes 5 and 6 last night. Josh Hennig, Ryan Rothstein here. We got to talk about some of The Last Dance, Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, and more, of course. We also got to have a little discussion about the Eagles and the Cowboys, plus rest in peace, Don Shula passed away today, the winningest coach in NFL history. Ryan, may the 4th be with you today.
Of course. This is your favorite day of the year, is it not?
That's a misconception. I'm a much bigger Marvel guy than I am a Star Wars fan, but I have a very strong appreciation for Star Wars and its fandom.
Yeah, Marvel doesn't really have a day like, Star Wars and May the 4th be with you, but
Marvel days are whenever the movies come out. That's a Marvel day.
So it's like every other week.
Well, in this case, I gotta wait till November for the next Marvel movie.
Outside of a pandemic. But yeah, man, listen. We got a lot to get into, and obviously The Last Dance is at the top of our list. And here's something I'll just start off with. This documentary, to me, is getting better and better. I don't know if you feel the same way.
It's growing, yes. It feels like it's expanding and growing and building on itself. And I really wanted to play that Kobe cut, Ryan, because one of the things I took away from the documentary last night is, watching the whole part about the All-Star game and, the more highlights they show of the Jordan era, which, was very indelible for me because from, that the first Bulls three-peat was the first time that I was genuinely aware of basketball. Before that, because, you're at a certain age, you're not really aware of the world around you. You're just aware of, what's in front of you. You can't really absorb anything else around you until you get to a certain age. And the first Bulls three-peat was a very big deal for you. That was the first thing that I remember basketball-wise, the Dream Team and all that. And I'm reliving some of these highlights, and all I can think of, Ryan, is for the people who didn't see Jordan, they may not understand, or maybe they're now understanding, Ryan, how much Jordan has impacted the game. Jordan was doing stuff in the 90s that we are now seeing other players do. And I do have to wonder, Ryan, how much of today's game would be what it is if it wasn't for Jordan setting that precedent of the style of play and athleticism.
I think that's the biggest takeaway from this documentary, The Last Dance, so far, Josh, is we have these GOAT conversations. You and I have had them. Gil has had them. Anyone in our industry, and really just anyone all over the world who's a basketball fan, has had the GOAT conversation. And I think this documentary is just giving us more and more evidence as to why MJ is by far the favorite for the majority of people. What did in the lines and what he did in between the lines was absolutely GOAT worthy in itself. But it's what you said, Josh. It's the timing of the dream team and Jordan being the best player on arguably the most important team to take the game to an international level. It's the timing of the Bulls' success. All of that you start to really see through this documentary for someone who's not really over 40 years old. Anyone younger than 40 who is under 15, 14 years old at the time, I think is just getting a reminder and a stronger appreciation for all of that. Wouldn't you say so?
Absolutely. And I think that the appreciation, I think, because, as you said, the documentary feels like it's getting better each week. It's building on the previous episodes. Listen, I don't know about anybody else, but each week I've been rewatching the previous episodes leading in to the new episodes. I feel like it's like appointment viewing for me. And I feel like I'm getting more rewatching some of those episodes each time. And now that we're halfway through this documentary, and as you know, I've been reading Playing for Keeps by David Haberstrom, the very detailed book that kind of is written similar to how this documentary is playing out, Ryan, but with more detail and depth. I feel like I have a better understanding today because of everything with this documentary and everything I'm reading about Michael Jordan, not just the player, not just the superstar, not just the legend, but his impact on the game, because I literally don't think that people fully can appreciate the fact that there are things that LeBron James and Dwayne Wade and Kobe and all these guys did. They literally got these ideas from Jordan, whether they are conscious of it or not.
The game was different before Jordan.
Very different.
And that's the biggest thing. That's why to lead today's show with that Kobe audio is perfect, because he not finally, I don't know if I've ever heard that clip from Kobe. Was that a direct sit down for this documentary?
Yes. I was actually listening to the director talk about this. He said that all the footage from Kobe, that interview, was filmed the day of the ESPYs last year.
Okay. Wow.
So apparently they met with Kobe in his home office the afternoon of the ESPYs, and then he literally went from there right to the ESPYs.
Okay, there you go. And just my point of that all is that's the first time I think we really heard from Kobe say, listen, everything I've done is because of this dude. So if Kobe's saying that, well, then guess what? X equals LeBron and D Wade and everyone else that came with and after Kobe Bryant. It's just you got to point to number 23, and number 23 is MJ.
Yes. And let's not also forget that when I was watching that scene of them in the locker room, Jordan and all those guys talking about Kobe, you notice how differential those guys were. The Grant Hills, the Penny Hardaways. Like, you looking at that picture of that Eastern Conference squad from 98, that All-Star game, heck, Ryan, I think that All-Star team might be any All-Star team of any era. I mean, that might be one of the greatest All-Star rosters of all time, looking at that picture.
But what stood out to me, Josh, is how they really didn't know Kobe Bryant.
Correct.
And yeah, maybe they just were purposely not giving him the love, like, oh, that's that young teenager, that young kid, blah, blah, blah. Oh, the kid on the Lakers. Like, it was as Michael Jordan said, I think, or no, Kobe said it was an older time back then. So for someone to come in at Kobe's age, especially back then, it was just it was unheard of. And what Kobe had to do to really break himself in. I mean, we know about every single prospect the Sixers have. We know about every big prospect any NBA team has. For them to not really know Kobe, it's like the whole world knows about Dario Saric when he's coming over to the Sixers.
Yes.
At the time, legitimate players in the league didn't know about Kobe Bryant. And that just goes to show you how much it's changed from then to now.
609-403-0973 is the text port to get on the conversation. 609-403-0973. Speaking of Dario Saric, how about the whole background about Tony Kukoc and how those guys were so mad at Krause? And it was like Jerry Krause is turning into not as much just a pure villain, but he's turning into like the guy who is constantly looking for a new girlfriend, even though he's in a great relationship. Like he's dating a 10, but he keeps looking for 7.5s. Like, what is up with this guy's obsession with everyone else who was not his own players? It was like watching this documentary and then reading what I've been reading, Ryan. Doesn't it feel like he's like a guy who's just not happy with his current relationship?
Oh, absolutely. Because the significant other in this relationship is MJ, and MJ was not giving him the love and attention, and the love and attention from an outside perspective was not going to Krause. I had this question written down. what would Jordan and the Bulls have become without Jerry Krause? Because this documentary has taken, I think, the viewer on somewhat of a roller coaster ride with how we view Jerry Krause. And now with the most recent episodes last night, I got to the point in my head, Josh, where I'm like, it seems like everything Jordan and Pippen and Rodman and Phil Jackson were fueled by stemmed from Jerry Krause at some point or another.
Yeah, it's so strange because Krause was so incredibly good at getting Scotty and getting Horace Grant and finding Tony Kukoc in Europe, and then they eventually brought in Rodman and they brought in Steve Kerr and all these different guys. So like on one hand, he was so good at like roster development, but he was such a sour person at like cultivating what he already had. It's like he went and got it and he was like, and I want more. I need like the whole thing with Dan. Was it Dan Marley on the documentary last night? You know how much? Yep. Oh, Krause loved him, so I was going to take it to him every chance I got. And I'm just like thinking like, how nuts is it that like this GM literally is like in love with everyone who's not his own players, but yet he couldn't see it for himself, and nobody had the foresight to turn to him and be like, "Yo, Jerry. Stop looking at the other girls on Instagram. Like you got a 10 in front of you."
On Instagram. Dude, I think that question I pose is interesting. Like, what would Jordan have become and the Bulls have become without Jerry Krause? I think it's very fair to say, and it's extremely hypothetical, but it's fair to say they would not have turned out the way they have if they had a different general manager. Don't you think so?
Ryan, doesn't it almost feel like they needed Jerry Krause to be the bad guy almost?
100%. They needed Jerry Krause. I mean, you think about all the moves that shaped that team, right? I mean, Doug Collins losing the job to Phil Jackson. You have to think Jerry Krause is saying in his mind, well, I have this outside the box assistant right here. Doug Collins and MJ have this great relationship. Doug's feeding him the ball and he's getting all these looks. I'm going to go do this. And that move ended up being the difference maker, and all these other moves with Tony Kukoc, and the list goes on. But I don't know what that team would have become if it was a normal, so to speak, general manager.
The other thing is, and this would never have happened back then, but it's more likely to happen. You know, if the Bulls played in today's era, you know, the Sixers have gone through now 3 GMs in the last several years. People get fired way more in today's world than back then. Would Jerry Krause have been the GM during the second three-peat? Would he have maybe been fired in between three-peats?
Do you really think? I mean, yes, I think that's a safe answer is yes. I just don't think he would have lasted throughout that whole time that he did.
100% he would not have. You're 100% right.
I mean, come on, dude. It's like, and the owner didn't even see it. He was blind to it too. Like,
well, the owner didn't care. Let's be realistic. Reinsdorf let Krause take all the bullets because he didn't want to deal with this stuff. He was off in his own little, high place. He didn't want to be, he literally used Krause as a shield from him because he didn't want to take responsibility for anything.
But it's just interesting to me that, like, yeah, the dream team joked about, oh, you can't touch Michael. You can't get you're going to get a foul called on you regarding Michael. Outside of that, though, it was not a players' league during Jordan's time. Like, Jordan doesn't get the same treatment that LeBron gets in today's league, in today's NBA. Jordan was still getting like shortchanged a little bit with a lot of things, and he had to overcome a lot of things that in today's NBA, it would have been handed for him. It would have been dealt. The dirty work would have been done by someone else, and Jordan was still doing, I feel like, a lot of dirty work, Josh.
And by the way, speaking of that dirty work, it was the defense. The guy was a defensive player of the year. He was all defensive team numerous times. He was. There were blocks that they were showing highlights of last night that literally the only people we've ever seen do those blocks are like guys like LeBron and Durant, who are taller and longer than Jordan is. Like, Jordan was playing defense in a way that a lot of guys today never would even consider.
No. Well, the defense doesn't exist how it existed back then. And that's what I was going to put a little like highlight thing together last night of. You look at Michael Jordan and what he had to do to get a bucket at the rim and in the paint, and you look at highlights of like what LeBron has to do to get a bucket at the rim and in the paint, And it's night and day. Jordan had Ewing and Oakley waiting for him, who are going to give him an elbow to the jugular. And LeBron has, DeAndre Jordan ducking out of the way. Like, it's just a different game, man, both on the floor and off it.
Yeah, it absolutely is. 609-403-0973. Before we get to a great question that Ryan asked me before the show, I want to get this text from Dan EHT. He says, I understand the airness to MJ, but they should have called it the Jordan Dance or the Air Dance documentary. And I understand where Dan is coming from because, there is a perception that maybe the documentary is too Jordan-centric and not enough about the other moving parts. But where I would disagree with Dan, Ryan, is that I think that the documentary has done a great job at highlighting Rodman, Phil, Scotty, BJ Armstrong, maybe not as much about Horace Grant, but talking about Jerry Krause, talking about Tony Kukoc, talking about Barkley and Isaiah and these other guys. I feel like it's done enough of the other people to allow it to be all-encompassing and not just too Jordan-centric.
Yeah, I don't think it's too Jordan-centric at all, and I don't think that type of name change would make more sense. Like, we had a whole episode on Rodman. We had a whole episode on Phil, on Scotty.
The bad boys.
A lot, the bad boys. A lot on Tony Kukoc last night. A lot on Barkley and that team last night. So, no, I think it's perfect. I think it illustrates the last dance, which is that last season, the Bulls win it all. And they're able to branch off that season perfectly and tell stories that piece everything together, that puts that last run into perspective for everyone. So I think The Last Dance is spot on with the title.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I don't remember if you put it on Twitter or you said it to me separately, but you had mentioned the fact that, and I agree with you, I love the way they're interweaving the past with the present.
Yes.
It's not just the final season. Like, they're taking you back to the beginning for these guys. They're taking you back in time, and they're showing you almost like the connective tissue between the final season and everything that happened before it. I love that because of the fact that, there's so little context in today's world when it comes to when we debate sports. You and I can get up here and debate something, but if a listener doesn't agree with one of our opinions, they may not take the full context of the conversation in when they take a side on a debate. Whereas this documentary is literally forcing you to gain context about the good and the bad of everything. Everything that Jordan went through on and off the court, everything that happened with Scottie Pippen and Dennis. It feels like this documentary is forcing people a little out of their comfort zone to say, hey, listen, there is more here than what you realize.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot of takeaways from the two episodes last night. I mean, the Atlantic City story, Michael Jordan's gambling, which they touched on a lot. I still think they left out some big stories intentionally, and we can maybe get to that later in the show. But for me, Josh, the biggest takeaway, one of them at least from last night, is Jordan laying on that couch in the hotel, and he's just exhausted from all of the noise. And I can't help but think, you would think the answer to this question is today, but I don't know. How much difficult was it to be a star back then compared to now? Like, you would say with social media that now is more challenging, but after watching 6 episodes of this and what Jordan was dealing with, I almost feel like because of the lack of technology at that time, it was more challenging for him to be a star and the guy he was in that era than it would be now.
Here's how I would answer that question. I would say that it's a little of both. I think that it was more difficult back then because Jordan and Magic and Bird were the first 3 mega stars because of the modern television era. ESPN only came on board in 1979. The 24-hour news network started to grow in the 80s and 90s. So I think it was a little harder in that the structure, people didn't know how to handle it back then. They were kind of learning on the fly. Whereas today, the security and the shielding of the athletes and the whole thing where, the Bulls in the 80s used to fly commercial and they eventually had to go charter. Nobody flies commercial anymore. I mean, that's just ridiculous. The idea that you could see Michael Jordan in first class ahead of you on an airplane. I mean, that's just nuts. Whereas today, you would never see LeBron on the same plane as you. So I think in that way it was harder. I think the problem with the modern age is that because you have all these athletes who grew up without having to go through some of the hard stuff that the other athletes did before them, that maybe there's not as much of an appreciation for the fame that they get sometimes.
I would agree with that. And I think social media, it sounds crazy, but I think social media makes it easier on today's player at times because there's so much BS and noise that comes through social media. And there's so many stories now, and everyone knows how to handle that noise, that it's not as challenging. Whereas back then it was, the coverage was amped up and these players didn't really know, I think, how to handle it like the players do today. I don't know. I just think that piece of it is an interesting dynamic overall.
Definitely. 609-403-0973 is the text board. Coming up, Ryan's got a great question that came out of last night about Charles Barkley. Plus, which offense is actually better on paper, the Eagles or the Cowboys? We're getting all that and more coming up. Josh Hennig, Ryan Rothstein. You're listening to the warm-up here on 97.3 ESPN FM and the 97.3 ESPN mobile app.
Got to see, that's how I dream to be.
I dream I move, I dream I groove, like Mike. If I could be like Mike, I wanna be like Mike. Like Mike, if I could be like Mike.
I mean, you can't beat a classic, Ryan, like that.
Man, why'd you have to cut it off like that? I was dancing over here. That's an all-time jam.
Yeah, to pull back the curtain, the song is actually still going. But in order for us to hear you, I had to take it out of your ear.
No, come on, you got to pick the song over me every time.
Like Mike, if I could be like Mike. I wanna be like Mike. Like Mike, if I could be like Mike. Oh, be like Mike. Like Mike, if I could be like Mike.
I will say this. My favorite part of the commercial, now looking back on it now in my older cynical ways as an older person, Brian.
Yep.
The fake laughing of Jordan in the commercial is really funny.
I have to look at that again. I can't exactly get that image.
Well, here, I'll send you the link so you can watch it during the next break. But
Awesome.
The awkward fake laughing of Jordan while drinking Gatorade throughout the whole commercial actually is very weird and funny now, watching it now that I'm older, because when I was younger, all I cared about was the song. Now that I'm older and I'm like, get off my lawn and, crusty, I'm like, why was he laughing? Why is he laughing so much in this commercial? Like, what was so funny?
I'm more concerned of you being crusty, but anyway.
Well, we're all in a bubble, so I mean.
Yeah, no, that's true.
I need more fresh air.
It's tough times out here. I hear you. Before I get to my question,
yeah,
this conversation just made me think of this. What about MJ referring to himself as immortal during that one clip last night? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, and it was one of those things where I find that when athletes talk about themselves, I find it very interesting because of the fact that you can tell that sometimes these guys, they say stuff and then they kind of have a look on their face like, I might have said that and it didn't come out the right way.
Yeah, I don't know if MJ falls.
No, he doesn't. But he doesn't at all. Like, he just says what he thinks and that's it. Whereas, like, if you ever notice, like, when Larry Bird talks about himself, he has that look on his face like, should I really have said that about myself? Whereas Jordan just literally everything comes out of his mouth. He does not give a you-know-what. He just tells you what he thinks and bam, it's there. Whereas there's so many other athletes, they're so, they feel like they have to be measured. And it's like Jordan already measured it before it came out. Whereas there are other athletes that are measuring it while it comes out of their mouth.
Right. I mean, Jordan at that time was, I don't blame him. I just thought it was cool that the cameras caught him actually saying that because I'm sure he felt like that at some points. Clearly, probably in that moment, he legitimately felt like that with everything going on.
Absolutely. So I want to get to your question, Ryan, because it's a great question. It's a question that has a lot to do with also with our area as well, about one of the participants in the documentary last night.
Yeah, so obviously the documentary, as we mentioned, has done a great job of going back in time and setting the stage for the last dance that's going to lead up to, Jordan's shot in Utah for that final Larry O'Brien trophy. But Charles Barkley and the Phoenix Suns, all right, that was the finals matchup that they went back to at one point during, was it episode 6 last night? It might have been 5 and 6. Yeah, it was 6.
It was mostly 6. He was like part of 5 because of the Dream Team, but 6 was the 93 finals.
Right. So a lot of people, Barkley's older than Jordan. So we've talked a lot about how people may not have gotten to really understand and know how good MJ was in between the lines. Charles Barkley, I think, is even more so. He's not MJ, but I think a lot of young people don't realize how good Barkley was. And we've heard about the beef between Barkley and Draymond Green. People have said Draymond Green's a better basketball player than Charles Barkley. And last night we had the tape. We had the evidence of really how good Barkley was, especially in that finals run with the Phoenix Suns. So I ask you, Josh, and the listeners out there, is Charles Barkley a little bit underrated? And did last night and this Last Dance documentary kind of remind everyone who Sir Charles really was on the basketball floor?
609-403-0973 is text word for the listeners to jump in. I would say, yes, he is underrated, and I hope last night you got a glimpse of it, because on this day, this specific day, Ryan, back in 1993, Charles Barkley scored 56 points in the final game of a sweep of the Golden State Warriors. It's the third highest point total in postseason NBA history, behind only Michael Jordan and Elgin Baylor. That's Charles Barkley that you saw last night. Peak Charles. And I love the story behind him scoring the 56. So I don't know if you heard this story, Ryan, but I want to retell it real quick. So apparently Charles was never told about the contents of a commercial that he was going to be in. They told him that he was going to shoot a commercial with Chris Webber. Well, he shot his part and then left. Come to find out that the commercial basically had Chris Webber dunking all over Barkley in this commercial. And Barkley was so mad that he took advantage of the opportunity to sweep the Warriors and Chris Webber back then. And during the game when he scored 56, he was yelling at Don Nelson. Yes, Don Nelson was the coach of the Warriors back in the day. He was yelling at him, "When are you going to double team me, bro? I'm killing you."
Dude, Barkley was on another level. And listen, Jordan took things personal, but I feel like Barkley did as well. And I think some people look at Barkley, because he has no rings, as like this guy that didn't have that it factor. Like he just didn't have that special difference maker that the superstars, that the champions have. And I don't think that's true. I just think Barkley got dealt a few bad hands in his career, man. But that center stage finals appearance with Barkley and the Suns, that's as impressive as it gets.
Yeah, during those playoffs that we're talking about, Charles Barkley averaged 26.6 points per game for the whole postseason. And it's incredible because when you look back at his career, when he was in Philadelphia as a 76er, he led the league not once, not twice, but 5 times in 2-point shooting percentage. Like that, who is going to do that in today's game? All these guys, all they do is ever shoot threes. But Charles Barkley was putting up 63% from 2-point range. Like, that means the dude's making almost 2/3 of his shots every game. And he was doing that in Philadelphia before he became an MVP with the Phoenix Suns.
Yeah, and that year that we're really focusing in on, like you said, NBA MVP, okay? Beat Jordan. And I know you probably could have given it to Jordan. The NBA MVP award can be questioned sometimes because it's kind of like a your turn, my turn type of award. But you still have to be in the running to even be considered the your turn, my turn guy. So it's still impressive. But just you look at what Barkley had to do on that team. he was the only real legitimate scorer. They had some great guys, but you knew the ball was going to Barkley. He had to play defense. He had to rebound. He had to knock down shots. He had to bang inside. I mean, what he was able to do as a player in his prime, especially that 93 year, I think that really opens up, I hope it does at least, opens up your eyes and say, okay, Barkley might be the greatest power forward of all time.
He really might be because, first of all, and me, I'm not very high on Karl Malone, but can we all admit that Charles Barkley was a better athlete than Malone? Like, Malone is a great scorer, and he had that great. I don't
know, man.
He had that great range jump shot, but Barkley was a little shorter than Malone. Barkley averaged double-digit rebounds every year of his career.
Barkley was definitely fatter.
Well, sure, but maybe before he started becoming thicker, he was still leaping over dudes. He also averaged at least a steal a game every year of his career until the final season when he got injured and his body fell apart. Barkley was such an incredible, well-rounded superstar at the power forward. If you don't put him in the conversation for greatest power forwards of all time, then you shouldn't be in the conversation even talking about it, because Barkley was doing stuff that nobody his height was doing. He was 6'6" on a good day with some high heels. Like, listen, I've met Charles. He's not over 6'6", trust me. But he is still an incredible athlete. And people will talk about how, when he was in the 80s at Auburn, there are some people who say, because him and Bo Jackson were at Auburn together in the 80s, some people wondered who was the better athlete, Barkley or Bo. That's how incredible of an athlete Barkley was back in the day.
And here's the mindset that I kind of look at it. If you believe that Jordan is the GOAT, the king, the all-time greatest, well, then guess what? I don't know if you can have that line of thinking and say that Chuck isn't top 10 of all time and Chuck isn't the best power forward of all time. Chuck went toe-to-toe in the same era as Michael Jordan. He went head-to-head in an NBA Finals, took him 6 games, had a couple unbelievable performances, mano-a-mano, with MJ. So I don't know what other evidence you can have if you have that direct evidence competing against the guy that you feel is the GOAT. I think that's the end of the convo right there, is it not?
It definitely has to be in the conversation, because also you mentioned his teammates. Malone had Stockton. Tim Duncan had David Robinson and Tony Parker and Manu and all these other guys. Kevin Garnett, when he won, he had Paul Pierce and Ray Allen, 2 bona fide Hall of Famers next to him. Charles Barkley's teammates were Dan Marley, KJ, Kevin Johnson, who was a phenomenal scorer in his own right, but he was certainly a point guard. He was not a number one scorer on any team. Cedric Ceballos, Tom Chambers, Danny Ainge. You could argue that of all the Bulls teams, that for all 6 of their championships, that the Suns might have been the weakest roster of all of them, and that's how great Barkley was.
I would say that is by far their weakest opponent, right? I mean, who else did
roster depth?
Yeah, as far as roster depth, I mean, who else were the other 5? It was Utah. It was Detroit. Not Detroit. That was the conference finals.
Well, you had the Lakers with Magic.
Lakers.
Yep. You had the Portland Trailblazers, which were a super stacked team. I mean, you had Cliff Robinson and Terry Porter and Clyde Drexler. I mean, that roster was just super deep. And then you had the Supersonics with Gary Payton. You had Sean Kemp. You had an older Sam Perkins, Detlef Shrimp. Like that, those other teams, it was like, oh, that makes sense. That team was a really good team back in the day. And then you look at the Suns, you take Barkley off that team, they're probably winning maybe 38 games, maybe 40.
They're maybe a playoff team without Barkley.
Like that team went 62-20 when Barkley won the MVP. They're probably going 42-40 without him.
Oh, it's absolutely, listen, it's insane. And so that's the point. Like, Josh, did those episodes last night change your opinion with Barkley at all?
I definitely think it shines a light more on Charles. I mean, I'm a little biased. That 93 Suns team was the only team that I ever cheered for against the Bulls. So I'm a little biased in my opinion about that team. But I think you're right. I think that as time has gone on, there has been a light taken off of Charles partly because of who he is today. Most people only know him as the commentator and the big hefty dude now. They don't really remember him as much because when he was with the 76ers, when he was with the Suns, he was a bona fide superstar level player in the game. And during his era, he was in the conversation for best players in the game. Listen, as Charles Barkley has said, Jordan was the greatest of his era. No one can debate that. But when it came to guys 2 through 5, Barkley was in the debate along with guys like Elijah Wan and Isaiah Thomas and Karl Malone, those other guys.
Oh, he absolutely. And I think because you make a good point, because of what Chuck does now, and he's essentially a superstar for an NBA analyst, an NBA personality. Like he's as big as it gets, and he's known in households across the country, and you can maybe argue certain places in the world. And that takes away, I think, from what he was able to do on the floor. So like last night's episode, I think was a little bit of a reminder, like, yo, this dude was one of the best all time. Don't get it twisted.
Let's get a different side of the conversation because Dan from EHT chimed in at 609-403-0973. He disagrees with both of us. He says, no way. Charles was overrated. Charles was a great rebounder, but terrible defender that shows up to play defense. Effort is defense. He was an underdog that so many people appreciated. See, and listen, I understand because Dan says I'm 47 years old. Well, I don't know if your age really, how much that really matters in the conversation. I mean, we appreciate that you're.
I think he's saying he saw it firsthand, maybe.
Well, I mean, listen, it's not like I'm 12, now. Like I saw it too. And listen, I disagree with you, Dan, because first of all, if you're talking about effort, rebounding is effort. You don't become a great rebounder without effort. So, he may not have been an elite defensive player, but let's be realistic. Outside of Jordan and a handful of others, how many dudes were really elite defensive players who were superstars? Like, it's not like Karl Malone was out there blocking shots all the time, or a guy like who were some other power forwards in that area. Sean Kemp was all offense and no defense. I mean, he had a couple of highlight blocks, but he wasn't like a legitimate rim protector. Barkley was too short to be a rim protector. Getting a steal per year, as Barkley did, he averaged in his career 1.5 steals a game. You don't get 1.5 steals a game, and you don't average 11.7 rebounds a game for your career if you don't put out some effort. So I think the idea that Barkley didn't put in the effort is a little false.
Well, if you're looking at just the defensive end, I mean, okay, maybe I can pick up what you're putting down, but like you're right, like rebounding is a skill and effort. That's it. Like it's something that you can't really teach. Like people that have the instinct to be a great rebounder can get better at it. As we saw Rodman a couple episodes, he told us like how he practiced rebounding. But Rodman at the end of the day was just born with a gift. Charles Barkley was born with a gift, and they brought the effort to go along with that gift. And that's just a fact. Anyone who's played basketball at any level, the rebounding aspect is not easy, and it's the effort that you have to bring. And Barkley, so what? Maybe he took a couple plays off, but he had to. Like, you have to understand, if you're the guy that has to do everything, okay, and if they need me in the last 5 minutes to score consistently, I might have to take a couple plays off on the defensive end in the first half. That's just how basketball works.
By the way, Charles Barkley was a all-NBA first or second team 10 times during his career. So that's nothing to sneeze at either. 11-time All-Star, as well as we mentioned, the league MVP. He was the All-Star Game MVP one year. So he had a pretty great career. He's no Jordan, but who is?
That's what I was going to wrap up with. Like, yeah, okay, maybe Jordan brought it every play on the defensive end, but that doesn't mean you knock Barkley for not doing that, because almost no one could do what MJ did. That's what we're seeing.
He's Ryan Rothstein. I'm Josh Hennig. This is the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN. I just want to remind everyone that this is the last week for Sports Bash Cash. 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, your chance to win $1,000 with each word up to $10,000. The more words you put in. So if you've missed out or you haven't won yet, keep on playing. 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. This is the last week for Sports Bash Cash. You're on 97.3 ESPN FM. 609-403-0973 is the text board. Josh Hennig, Ryan Rothstein will wrap up the show coming up on the other side. Josh Hennig, Ryan Rothstein here on the warm-up. Before we end out the show, I did want to take a moment to talk about Don Shula. Don Shula, for those who may have heard or maybe didn't hear, he did pass away today. That's one of the two news items I wanted to hit real quick here before we get out of here. Don Shula, for those who maybe are not as deep historians of the game as I am, Don Shula was very huge part of the history of the game because of the fact that he was the coach of the Colts with Johnny Unitas before the Dolphins. He got to the Dolphins. He was the head coach of the only undefeated team in NFL history. He's the guy who ended up with Dan Marino in the early 80s, that huge quarterback draft where Marino kept dropping and dropping. John Elway went number 1 overall. The interesting thing with Shula, though, Ryan, is that for a guy who is the winningest coach of all time, I would argue, though, he's definitely not the greatest at all because of the fact that part of him having that number of most wins had to do with longevity more so than elite greatness, because that second half of his coaching career, he had trouble, him and the Dolphins, putting a great team around Marino. Those Marino teams at the end of the Shula era looked more like the Aaron Rodgers team from last year than they did elite football teams, where Rodgers having to carry, Valdez Scantling and guys like that. That was what Dan Marino was having to do. He literally only had a couple of bona fide receivers at the end. And part of it was because Shula was just hanging on for that. So I'm not saying this to besmirch the guy on the day that he passed away, but, let's put a little context on the fact that the guy's a legend. But if you really want to break it down, I would argue that guys like Belichick and Chuck Noll and Bill Walsh, Joe Gibbs, Vince Lombardi, I would personally have them all ahead of Shula on my personal greatest coaches of all time list.
You mentioned Bill Belichick. I know that Shula, from what I read, he's only one of 3 coaches to ever win more than 300 games or more. And listen, if you want to knock him a little bit there for maybe it's not all that it's wrapped up to be with his legacy, the fact that he still sustained that role for such a long time in the NFL is impressive in itself. Like, I don't know how much you can knock someone for saying, well, a lot of those statistics are just a result of him being around a long time. I think him being around a long time is a sign of how good he really was, is it not?
It's partially, but I think we also overlook the fact that, you have one of the 5-10 greatest quarterbacks of all time under center helps a little bit too.
Oh, of course. But I mean, as we know from The Last Dance that we just talked the entire show about, it works both ways. You could be the best coach in the world. You need that player or two, and the player or two needs that coach. So I think he was able to coach him up, and it worked out with talent on the field. But I don't know. Where do you rank Shula then? His legacy is what for you, Josh?
I would say he's probably the 5th best coach, in my opinion, in NFL history. I think that we can never overlook the fact that Belichick has to be number 1 because he's done what he has done in a salary cap era, in an era that's supposedly part of parity. And then, 2, 3, 4 to me, I would probably, personally, I would say Bill Walsh would be number 2 because how innovative he was. I would go with Chuck Noll, number 3. I don't think Noll gets enough credit for the team that he built in Pittsburgh and how dominant they were in the 70s. And then you can't forget Vince Lombardi. Vince Lombardi changed the entire NFL, and he was part of some of the biggest moments in football history, and he set the precedent for a lot of football to come with a lot of his game planning and his perspective. So I personally would have Shula 5th.
I asked earlier if it was more difficult to be Michael Jordan in the 90s than it would be now. So I'm going to ask the same question here. Do you think it was more challenging to be an NFL coach back then, or is it more challenging now?
I would say it was more challenging back then for this specific reason. You didn't have all the resources that people have today. You know, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you didn't have all the analytics and the resources and the 200, not literally 200, but all the people on your coaching staff. I mean, those coaching staffs today are ridiculous sometimes. Like, there are dudes who literally just, what are they doing on the sideline, some of them? Yeah, you have
They're
the assistant.
on the tablets.
You have assistant quarterback coaches. Like, there were no assistant quarterback coaches back in the day. Some of these teams didn't have quarterback coaches. You just had an offensive coordinator and a position coach for maybe one position. Like, as the game evolved, you know, some of the challenges early on of scouting and evaluating and game planning started to go away. Now, where it's harder today, Ryan, like I said, is the salary cap. You know, having a salary cap and having parity in the league and having, you know, these super high priced players that you have to, you can't be the dictator of anymore. You have less practice time. That's definitely harder today. Less practice time, more parity, more teams. So you have less players to draw from your roster. But I think that you could make a strong argument that the coaches back in the day had to be way more innovative and way more unique to have the success that they did.
Yeah, I would agree with you, but I would throw this nugget in there that you mentioned the resources that coaches have in today's game and how that makes things easier. But I would say that more resources does complicate things. More information does complicate things, and it brings about new problems. So I guess you could say the simplicity of the game and how coaches coached during the Shula era, quote unquote, that also, I think you can make an argument, simplified things for him.
It definitely did. By the way, really quick, the other news, I recommend people go to 973ESPN.com. The news came down today from Governor Phil Murphy that high school season is done. The high schools will remain closed the rest of this year. There will not be no in-person learning, which means the spring season for all the high school athletes in our area will not happen this year. So, Ryan, really quick, I feel really bad for all the young athletes who are all seniors who have been deprived of their senior season of sports.
Yeah, it's a shame, man. I can't even imagine being a senior, you know, playing baseball or any of the spring sports. It's really tough. It's tough news.
All right, so check that out, 97.3 ESPN.com and the 97.3 ESPN mobile app. Ryan and I will be back tomorrow